Willy Wonka is a character with a surprisingly rich history. There have been over a dozen versions of the character that have spawned throughout the past 60 years the dude's been alive. And despite being just this weird eccentric figure in a top hat and tailcoat, people have managed to make many widely varying portrayals of the character. They can be described in a lot of ways. Warm, kooky, webcore, squishy. However, one adjective I wouldn't really use to describe the character would be scary? Wonka himself has always had this sort of unnerving edge. It's actually one of the defining traits of the character, but I wouldn't really describe the guy or any of his versions as flat out, in-your-face scary. Well, I would for one version of Wonka. One area of the Willy Wonka universe that I wish got more attention is the WONKA Company. Ever since the 1971 film leading up until the mid-2010s, there used to be like an actual Willy Wonka candy company, which was bought out by Nestle sometime in the late 1980s. During the company's lifespan, they've had a handful of mascots, usually trying to make some weird alternate version of Gene Wilder Wonka. The most popular one of these has to be the one they used during the late 90s up until the mid-2000s. This character was a really awesome mix of 1971 Wonka and Book Wonka. It's actually my most favorite version of the character, and I honestly cannot give enough praise for this design. It gives off both the soft and playful vibes of Book Wonka and the comedic liminal space vibes of 1971 Wonka. During this time when the mascot was being used, which I refer as the WONKA Company's retro era, the company and the mascot were everywhere. In magazines, on TV, on candy wrappers. It was a truly magical time for not just the company, but the entire franchise. As I can imagine, the ubiquitousness of the character helped spread awareness of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory as a whole. They even had their own website, famously referred to as Wonka.com. During the website's early years, you could do a lot of things. There was a Wonka school section that had lesson plans you could print, you could download wallpapers and videos, and most famously, the Flash games. There was also this service on the website called Club W or Club Wonka, or later My Club Dub, that you could access by creating an account. And here you could access a text-based adventure game called The Unpredictable Wonkanizer and a few other things, including the ability to ask Mr. Wonka himself random questions and have your birthday featured on the website. Of course, I don't think this Wonka is scary at all. The fact that he's essentially long forgotten and now he has multiple pieces of lost media that bears his name may mean he's a bit unnerving, but overall I think it's a really charming and endearing version of the character. He's colorful, he's friendly, he's playful, he's basically the perfect version of Wonka. Also, this version of Wonka had his own mascot costumes. Starting in the late 90s up until the late 2000s, they used to have this real-life Wonka-mobile that would tour across the US at various pit stops, handing out free candy and fun services wherever they stopped. The Wonka-mobile from the late 90s was this huge RV that had multiple fun things on it, tons of little rooms, and even one that replicated 1971 Wonka's office and a reading nook. During this time, they'd tour the US and hand out free books, as the company partnered with Reading is Fundamental during the tail end of the 90s. The mascot costume they used during this time aimed to really replicate the actual mascot in real life. It looks kinda freaky, but I wouldn't really call it scary, more kind of unnerving than anything. I actually can't help but appreciate the design almost. They did a pretty good job with what they were aiming for. By the turn of the millennium, they had created a new Wonka-mobile, this time going for a more simplistic purple van with the Wonka branding on it. This van did have some of its own little odds and ends, like this weird pair of binoculars that let you see into a little diorama of the Wonka factory, and a little computer that had the Wonka website built into it. During this time, they just sort of ride around the US handing out candy. When they actually did this, to my knowledge, is when they were either promoting fundraisers or with the multiple Wonka candy sweepstakes they held during the former half of the early 2000s. They used a different mascot during this time, and it went for a much more natural and human approach, which makes him look a lot more friendly. I really like this costume. The amount of attention to detail is pretty impressive, especially the head mold. There's a lot of detail that goes into it, and I also love how this head's pupils function as see-through shades. In some stock images of him, you can see the person in the costume just staring through the eyes, and something about it is just so hilarious to me. I don't think that this Wonka mascot costume is creepy at all, let alone scary. However, all of this was largely taking place in the United States. This was, rather ironically, Nestle Wonka's main homeland. It's where most of the memorabilia and sweepstakes and commercials and everything else occurred. Any Willy Wonka fan will be quick to point out the United Kingdom, since it's where Roald Dahl, Willy Wonka's creator, was born. The book and character are known for their British origins, which is why this company got a lot of special treatment in the UK. Considering how important the United Kingdom is to Willy Wonka's history, I can see why the Nestle WONKA Company would give the branch a bunch of special treatment in the UK, or at the very least try and make it feel unique compared to other regions. The Wonka brand in the UK originates at the very least back to the early to mid 1980s with these really strange exclusive candies like dweebs, which were supposed to be the opposite of nerds, all soft and sweet. They also had Wonka Fizzy Jerks, which are actually the one UK candy with the earliest archived commercial that is known to exist. And apparently it's on an edition of the UK 1971 film VHS. Okay then. The Fizzy Jerks were hard candy versions of the bottle caps candies we have in the US. Now for Wonka in the US, the brand's retro or golden era started around 1996 with a huge $1 million rebrand. The retro era for Wonka UK didn't start until around a year later in late 1998, I assume. They had Passion Pictures and some really obscure and probably now dead company named Ruse and Partners produce the visual advertising for the UK brand during this time. The former company you might recognize as they were behind a handful of Gorillaz music videos. They used Lightwave animation software to produce these really cool yet uncanny primitive 3D CGI visuals. Which brings us to the version of Wonka they used in the UK during this time. Ladies and gentlemen, the one version of Willy Wonka that actually scares me. The one and only version of the character that is genuinely able to keep me up at night. Even with all of the scary tunnel rides and really uncanny Swedish Wonka facial expressions, this is the version of Wonka that gets under my skin. But I'm sure you're wondering, how could some forgotten British advertising mascot be so darn horrifying? You'd be surprised. The Wonka candy brand has a very recognizable aesthetic. Colorful with an emphasis on purple, classic early 2000s eye strain, lots of really colorful machinery. Everything either had thick black or darker outlines, which made everything pop in a way. There wasn't much of an attention to detail. Stuff like hair and smaller objects had texture, yes, but other than that, everything was rather flat and colorful. It was largely your typical piece of 2000s memorabilia. Lots of colorful wackiness on eye strain. The mascot followed the same sort of flow. 2D, very colorful. The way this was handled in the UK around the same time was complicated. For some reason, a lot of candy wrappers and boxes and things, they used the normal 2D Nestle Wonka, which I for the life of me cannot understand. The only change they made was having Wonka's hair be more reddish orange than a bright gold, but that's about it. And from what I can gather, this was being used during the same time they were using the 3D mascot, so like, why? I mean, they did use the 3D mascot on select candy boxes and wrappers, but also they used the 3D mascot for 2D vectors on stuff like the back of candy selection packages because they wanted to make my brain hurt. But, what about the 3D mascot himself? This is terrifying. How did you take such a warm and comforting mascot and turn him into a freaking terrifying Five Nights at Freddy's character? Like, well, 3 words. Early computer graphics, provided by none other than Passion Pictures. And let's just look at this, the exaggerated everything, the glassy, almost doll-like eyes, the smile that says, "I want to destroy all humans," the oddly flat and simply textured hair. And in the commercials, it's just creepy. His movements are stiff and minimal, his mouth barely conveys anything other than just up and down, and his voice, provided by the legendary Jimmy Hibbert, sounds silly and non-threatening and friendly.
Boys, eaters, new Wonka Exploder, whatever next. What will he think of next? Don't hang about! Wonka hanging bags, what will he think of next?
Suspiciously so. This version of Wonka is not natural. The way he looks, the way he moves, the vibes his voice gives off, it's all really robotic. UK mascot is uncanny as all get out. It's Challenger deep levels of uncanny. However, this design is only around half of why I think this version of Willy Wonka is the scariest version of the character ever. The other half is arguably the main driving force of UK Wonka's fear factor. Lost media. It's actually a thing in the Willy Wonka universe, believe it or not. You have things like a deleted scene from the 1971 film, an old Swedish Charlie and the Chocolate Factory cartoon made by Sveriges Television in 1983. However, for the Wonka Candy Company, it's especially bad. For example, huge entire acres of the old Wonka.com website are lost. A Laffy Taffy puzzle game was actually lost to media for a while until it was found late last year. However, the area where this is most prevalent is with the Wonka Company's UK branch. Like I can't even come up with some stupid metaphor that tells you how much of the UK brand has been lost to time over the years. The problem is that bad. But what is lost from the UK brand? Again, quite a lot. I honestly don't even know where to get started. However, I think it's best to get started with what is, I guess, the most popular thing lost from this brand: the UK exclusive website games. These games, if you want to play them, then you might as well give up on that dream entirely for this one. The UK games are lost to time, and I don't think they will ever be found. Ever. As much as I hate saying it. First of all, why are these games lost? It largely has to do with a bunch of crazy shockwave flash mumbo jumbo that is going to be difficult to understand, but I'm gonna try my darndest to explain it. Basically, shockwave games run off of two file types: the DCR file, which is used to protect the game, and director cast files, which are data storage files. Director casts come in two file types, .cst and .cct, the latter being a compressed and encrypted version of the former. There are also internal and external casts. Internal casts being prepackaged with the DCR file, and external casts being individual files that are held on a website that the DCR file accesses while loading the game. The games from the US Wonka site ran off of internal casts, which means it was pretty easy to try and archive them. Just rip the DCR file from the page it was on and you're good to go. The UK games ran off of external casts, with stuff like audio and sprites and map data, each having its own .cct file that was stored on the wonka.co.uk servers. I can imagine this system made it astronomically difficult, if not virtually impossible, to try and archive the UK website games. Even then, I doubt anyone back then really gave a crap. Allow me to put this in perspective for you. The Wonka UK site was made in the UK, a much smaller area than the US. That means less people to be interested in the overall brand, including the niche flash games. But with all this talk, I'm sure you're wanting to know, what even were these flash games? There were around 9-ish that I do know existed, potentially 10. I'm gonna summarize them in no particular order. Also, do take most of what I say with these with a grain of salt, since no one has ever even breathed a word about these games in over 20 years, so my descriptions may or may not be accurate to what the actual games are like. The Golden Ticket game and the Wonka Factory game. Both of these were isometric platformers where you had to traverse a level trying to attain a specific goal under a time limit. In the Golden Ticket game, you had to break open boxes that granted you a golden ticket, and in the Wonka Factory game, you had to collect Wonka candies in a set order. Exploder game. Top-down driving game where you had to collect Sparky bits while also avoiding Sparky stealers. Exploder egg game. A quick-time event game where you had to shock gremlins hiding inside plastic eggs. Exploder dessert game. Basically, where's my water, but with gremlins sabotaging your pipes. Man, they really pushed for the exploder bars back then, didn't they? Wonka Vader Quiz. A quiz game for Charlie and the Chocolate Factory that was made to promote this contest they were holding sometime in late 2000, I believe. Wonkalit game. I've known about this game's existence for several months, and dude, I still don't know what to make of it. My best guess is that based off of what little info we do have, however, it's might be some version of the Adventures of Lolo, considering the concept of moving blocks and covering things is shared between both games. Wag game. A tower defense game where you had to prevent nerds from reaching a stash of Wag candies. The Oompa game. An action platformer where you had to traverse levels based off of the UK version of the Oompas candies they had back then. And that was a crash course for all of the Wonka UK games that are known to have existed. There could have been other games considering the other candies they had back then, but sadly there is no evidence of them ever having existed. The games as well as the UK website were developed by Pilot Interactive, and so much of their Wonka work has become non-existent. We have a couple of cast files for some of the games, and we do have a couple of mementos from the website, but most of it has sadly been lost. I do know of a potential 10th game and a candy designing room from a capture of Pilot Interactive's UK website via the Wayback Machine. Also, apparently the UK website has won like 2 awards, which I really can't say anything about because, again, this website is lost to time. However, something about it is really funny to me for some reason. This website, which has won multiple awards back in its heyday. Today, you'd be hard-pressed to find even a die-hard Wonka fan or nostalgia junkie who even knows about its existence. There were also other Wonka UK things. We know quite a few of the UK candies that existed. It is possible that all of them have at least minor documentation to confirm their existence, but considering how the UK branch is, I'm not 100% certain. Even some of the candies and chocolate bars were lost to time. They used to have Wonka biscuit bars. The only remnants of them today are a simple Wikipedia page and an article on the grocer talking about them. Sadly, no wrappers have been able to be preserved. They also had Lenny M Bug, based off of the Millennium Bug computer virus that raged throughout the early 2000s. I feel like the most obscure of these has to be the Wizzy Sticks. The only proof of their existence is on this Nestle UK article about the Wonka brand. Said article is now mostly gone from the website and you can only access it through the Wayback Machine. I really hope you guys are starting to see the unfortunate pattern here. They also had commercials. Instead of them being this awesome wild ride throughout the Wonka factory, we see UK Wonka being evil to two children and using them as lab rats. The blonde one might be Charlie based off of some info from one of the game's CCT files, but it's impossible to tell. There are 3 archived commercials, one for the Exploder bars, one for Wonkalit, and one for these hanging bag fruit snack candies. However, of course, there are lost commercials, one of which being for the Wonka biscuit bars, and they also made a commercial for the Oompas candies. Both of these commercials have not been archived. And who knows? For the Oompas one, considering how terrifying UK Wonka is, the idea of 3D British Oompa Loompa mascots almost makes me feel okay with the Oompas commercial being lost. Quite honestly, I think I could live without terrifying British 3D Oompa Loompas. Here's something interesting. We know that Wonka UK was associated with Cartoon Network UK and Nickelodeon UK. In terms of the latter, in January 2002, they held like this news thing for the Golden Ticket contest that took place that year, and they even had a Wonka microsite on the nick.co.uk website. All of these have also been lost. It is possible that the news coverage might be on someone's VHS collection somewhere, but I really would not hold my breath. What about sweepstakes? They held multiple golden ticket contests, one for every year from what I can gather, where the winners got to tour the actual Nestle Wonka factory in Illinois. Also, apparently they held this Easter event to celebrate the launch of the Exploder bars. What else is lost for this company? Are there any specifics that we can point to? Well, we don't know. That unknown factor is genuinely the biggest thing that makes me hail UK Nestle Wonka as the scariest Wonka. We don't know much about him, his factories, the candies he made, the sweepstakes he's held. It's all nothing more than a fading memory. And with each passing year, everything gets fuzzier. There will be less and less 2000s and 90s kids who really remember anything from the UK branch. What doesn't help is that Nestle UK's overall sales started declining during the turn of the millennium, which really did not help in everything. We don't know anything about what the websites had to offer, what the games truly played like, what the music was used for advertising, what the commercials truly looked like. We can't even really confirm whether or not UK Wonka had his own mascot costumes. That last one freaks me out especially because one time I had this weird dream where I was browsing this UK stock image site and they had images of UK Wonka mascot costumes. And I just remember waking up in a cold sweat thinking, what in the world did my brain just see, and whether or not stuff like that actually existed at one point. While doing research for this video, I came across this article on the York Press website talking about the Easter Exploder event I mentioned earlier, and apparently you got to meet Willy Wonka in York, in the UK Rowntree Nestle factory, and it was more than likely a guy in a mascot costume. I remember reading that article, thinking about my dream, and nearly getting chills when the realization hit me. Sadly, we will likely never know what this mascot costume looked like since the images in that article have become lost, or how horrifying the costume could have potentially been. Viewing it from that light, whether or not the mascot costume is lost, whether or not that's a good thing is honestly beyond me. Here's the $4 question though. Why did all of this become lost? First is the point I've said before, and I'll say it again. This was going on in the UK, a nation that has a lot less landmass than the US, and a smaller population, meaning less humans to give a crap about UK Wonka, and less humans to record his antics for posterity. This was also during the early 2000s, a time where preservation of digital media being of actual interest was largely non-existent. What doesn't help is that this company was owned by Nestle, who really does not care whether or not their stuff becomes lost media. The Flash games worked in very cumbersome ways and were only on the site for a small handful of years. All of this brewed one giant cocktail of epic failure. However, there is one last major reason as to why UK Wonka died. 2005 Wonka came along and ruined everything. Considering the rocky state of Nestle UK in the early 2000s, UK Wonka was already in trouble. But then the mid-2000s hit and he was yeeted into oblivion. When the 2005 adaptation released, it effectively took a massive dump all over every other version of Wonka that came before it. However, UK Wonka was on the worst end of this. You see this mascot? He's dead. 2005 Wonka killed him and he's not coming back. When the 2005 film released, Nestle overhauled everything Wonka, even in the UK. The UK website was changed entirely to promote the 2005 film and some golden ticket contest they were apparently holding during the time. Gone was the 3D exploration, the flash games, and everything relating to the mascot. Like, I'm not joking when I said that this man was thrust into the void. He was gone. After this, the company just sorta died. They did some special UK exclusive Wonka bars for the 2005 film's release, but other than that, the company remained largely dormant, with Nestle not really doing anything with the brand for nearly 8 years. This is in contrast with the US Wonka brand, which actually was doing things, lots of things back during the late 2000s. The UK branch was sort of non-existent until sometime in 2013 when they made new postmodern era Wonka bars, and even then, they weren't met with open arms because of how just out of this world unhealthy they were. If you look up old news articles, there are tons of people and authors being super concerned about the outrageous amount of calories in them. The bars were axed a year later due to dwindling sales. And yes, I am aware of the fake UK Wonka bar scare that took place last year, but those bars were counterfeit and weren't owned by Nestle, so I'm not counting that. And to think all of this happened because Tim Burton's Willy Wonka fanfiction turned movie. Like, I love Johnny Depp, he's one of my favorite actors, but the 2005 film is just awful. Not to mention how much of a negative influence it has been on the franchise. UK Wonka wasn't the only Wonka that was negatively affected. The main US mascot and the Swedish cartoon Wonka also got largely overshadowed by 2005 Wonka, but the UK mascot got hit the hardest. At least with those other Wonkas, we have plenty to remember them by, whether it be complete flash games or magazine ads or stills from the Swedish cartoon. We barely have anything to remember UK Wonka by, other than some images and news articles. Like, honestly, if you showed all of this to an unsuspecting person and said it was like this weird ARG, they would probably believe you. It's that bad. And it's just sad. With how surreal and interesting the UK branch advertising looks, it perfectly nails that plasticky, unnerving early CGI aesthetic. It's so unique and different compared to everything we've seen from the US branch. Too bad it's all lost media now! The WONKA Company has a lot of obscure tidbits, but the most apt example is the company's UK branch. For such a once popular brand being in the UK where the character was born, you barely hear about it. So many parts of the UK brand have become lost to time. The games, huge parts of the website, and pretty much everything else you can think of. However, there is one positive with how lost and mysterious all this is. It gives UK Wonka an identity. The scary CGI aesthetic, and especially the amount of lost media associated with him, gives this once forgotten mascot the high title of the scariest version of Willy Wonka ever. He is also one of the saddest. Such a cool and interesting and terrifying mascot. Him and his antics are lost to time, never to be seen or experienced again. Nestle UK had been using the mascot up until 2005. After this time period, however, Nestle basically chucked his butt into the trash heap and left him there. Left him there to die with all of the other things that Nestle has killed over the years. However, legend says that he still resides in that same trash heap, waiting for a chance to be reborn, to one day take back his crown as the king of UK confectionery. One day, he will come back, and when he does,